looking up, even when I'm down. Got my head in the clouds and my feet on the ground. I got big dreams, gonna make them true.
Hey, this is Coach Toby here in the Genius Lab, where we help you realize your greatness. This is part 3 of a series from my new book called Release Your Shit and Reclaim Your Power. Today we're going to talk about shit that's not your fault, okay? We live in a society where everybody blames somebody for everything, right? It's always got to be someone's fault. It's the liberals' fault. It's the conservatives' fault. It's the Democrats' fault. It's the Republicans' fault. It's the Christians' fault. It's the Muslims' fault. Everybody has all kinds of shame and blame going on. And I got to tell you, sure, the decisions that you make are your fault. All right? But guess what? There's a bunch of stuff that's not. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because we live in a society that is so run by guilt and shame, right and wrong, good and bad, black and white, it's really easy to get caught up in taking responsibility for things that are not your fault, things that you have no business taking responsibility for, and it's messed up. So what we're going to talk about today, to help you realize your greatness, we are going to talk about the things that are not your fault. Okay? These are things that you just come in loaded with. All right? You didn't choose them. You didn't ask for them. I don't care what the New Agers say. Oh, you chose everything. No, you didn't. Not necessarily. Science says differently. Mom and dad had a thing, and you were created. That is just like you didn't ask for it. So anyway, I know some of my New Age friends are pulling their hair out right now, but you know what? Get over it. With love. So here's a list of some things that I talk about in the book that I want to talk about in this podcast. And this is the shit that is not your fault. Boy, do I have good news for you. The things that are not your fault are often things that influence your self-esteem and your self-worth. You oftentimes, I remember my mom constantly saying, "You're a bad boy. You're a bad boy. You're a bad boy." And the reason I was a bad boy because I had a ton of energy and I got bored really easy, and I happened to be pretty brilliant, and I was a musician, and I wanted to play drums when I was 4 years old, and it drove my mom crazy. So, that made me bad. Well, thank God I'm getting over that stuff. But it took a while because that was imprinted. And the truth is my energy level was not my fault. It was part of my makeup. If I would have been in the village, they would have gone, you were born in a fire year. Guess what? You're going to have a ton of energy, a ton of creativity. We're going to give you a place to put it. And they would have helped it become an asset rather than being a thing that I blamed myself for being bad or wrong. So here we go. First thing that is not your fault is your DNA, and we were just talking about it, okay? You have mom and dad, you have a fertilized egg, and you just got dumped a bunch of DNA that does influence what you look like, what you act like, and the fundamental mechanism of how you function in the world is often about your DNA. Okay? Your race, your height, your weight, all of these things. And depending on what culture you're born into, your DNA either is an asset, you were born a supermodel because you've got good genes, they always say. Oh, you got good genes. Wow. Yeah. Or you don't. Now, in the United States, particularly, we see the girls in magazines that are all size 1, right? And what's so funny is that I've dealt with so many clients that are just like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I'm size 10 and no one loves me and I'm fat and ugly and blah, blah, blah. And, we're in a culture that's like really messed up because you practically have to be a skeleton to be okay, to be the right size, right? Okay, you go to Africa, it's just the opposite. The really thin girls, nobody wants them because they're poor and they don't have any food. The big girls, those are the ones everybody wants because they have abundance. Okay? So it's a cultural thing. So the way DNA plays in, if you're in the Western world and you're born with the DNA that makes it easy to, be a size 1 or 2, hey, guess what? You got lucky. If you're in Africa and you're a size 1 or 2, sorry for your luck. Okay? So, but your DNA is just your DNA, and it is what it is. And so you got to do the best you can with what you got. Second thing that is not your fault are what's called ancestral imprints. Now, this is a really interesting thing because you'll never hear about this in the West. But in Africa, I remember these elders talking about a ritual that needed to be done to remove ancestral imprints, and it really aroused my curiosity. So I'm like, what's this ancestral imprint thing? And they said, well, basically you come in with things from your ancestors, and some of the things are helpful and good, and some of the things are not helpful. And there was in this particular incident in the village, there was a son who was starting to replicate the behavior of his father, and his father had been a criminal. His father had passed away, but his father had been a criminal, and they wanted to not have the son follow that path, so they wanted to do a ritual to remove the ancestral imprints that were influencing this kid to have a certain kind of behavior that replicated his father's behavior. And I'm like, wow, that's really crazy, because I remember in my own life when I was in my 20s, I started smoking cigars. And I was out on my parents' back deck, and I lit up a cigar, and my dad looks at me. He's like, when did you start smoking cigars? Because no one in our family smoked cigars. And I said, I just like a year or so ago, I just thought it would be cool to smoke cigars. So I just started. He said, wow, that's interesting. I'll be right back. And he got up, and a couple minutes later, he came out with this beautiful wooden box with all this brass trim on it. And he said, here, you can have this. This is your grandfather's humidor. This is what he kept his cigars in. And it's interesting because I'm named after my grandfather. Actually, the Dagara people did a divination on me when I was in Africa on one of my trips, and they said I'm actually the reincarnation of my grandfather. He died when my dad was young, and I thought that was interesting. I'm named after him. And so that's one of the things that had no external influence, but created a habit or a pattern that didn't have a reference point in consciousness, but actually when we look at the DNA and we look at my grandfather's behavior, I was mimicking that, or I was connected to that through that DNA change, through that ancestral imprint. Okay? Another thing that happened, my dad called one evening, and he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just putting Adam, who's my stepson, back in those days. I said, just putting Adam to bed, and when he can't sleep, I take my guitar and I just make up silly songs and sing to him until he falls asleep. And my dad got really quiet, and he said, wow, my dad used to do that to me as well. Again, my dad never played guitar. There was, I was the music guy in the house. There wasn't anything that would influence that. Yet I followed this other pattern that came from my ancestor, and that ancestral imprint was really powerful and something that didn't have any kind of logical tie. I was not trained or influenced in any way. It was just an imprint I came in with. So these things are not your fault. Sometimes they're beneficial. I was really happy for, being interested in playing the guitar and stuff, influenced by my grandfather, the ancestral imprint that came in through him. And then there were other things in my life that, in terms of ancestral imprints that were not very helpful, but we won't get into those at the moment. Third thing that's not your fault. So we have DNA, we have ancestral imprint, now we have social protocol, okay? Oh my God, do we live in a society that has protocol or what? This makes you a good person, that makes you a bad person, on and on and on. There's lots of blame and shame and criticism and, oh my gosh, this is what good people do. This is what bad people do. If you behave this way, then you're good. If you behave that way, you're bad. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And we have different levels of social protocol as we get older. You know, I remember when Adam was a little boy. You know, he used to like to pee outside, so he would go out in the backyard and pee on the grass. And it's like his mom's like, "You don't do that at your friend's house, do you?" And he, you know, probably did. But anyway, he had to learn that as he got older that, you know, it's just not good social protocol to walk out in the backyard and pee. And so you learn as you go on. What's appropriate at one age might not be appropriate for another. You have certain protocol when you go to church, or if you go to a social organization, there's certain ways that you behave. If you go see the royal family, there's certain social protocol. And so when you graduate from being a young child, let's say in elementary school, or even from being a little baby to then being in elementary school, you learn another set of protocol, how to get along with kids, what's appropriate, you know, sitting and listening to the teacher, for example, and not squirming around or making a bunch of noise or disruption, because you have other people that are part of your community. And so you learn how to function in that community in a proper way, okay? And then as you get older, you know, you take on a job, you start to work, and then you learn another level of protocol. And perhaps after working, you become a leader in the workplace, which creates another aspect of social protocol. And then, you know, social protocol changes. In the 40s and 50s, there was a very male-dominated workplace, very patriarchal, very demeaning to women. Women were secretaries and assistants, and they were supposed to be available. And if a man got grabby, they were supposed to just tolerate that behavior because that's what men do. And now with the Me Too movement, they're saying, you know what? There's a new social protocol. That shit is not okay anymore. And, you know, it's the same way with humor. There's certain jokes that are funny or might have been funny at a certain point in time that then when something happens socially, they're not acceptable protocol any longer. And it's as we advance sociologically, hopefully advance, those social protocols become a higher level of functioning for the greater good of society. So social protocol is an important thing to pay attention to, and then to remember that if you're dealing with someone that's younger, particularly much younger, I had people when I had my restaurant and my coffee bars, I had high school kids working for me, and I had to teach them the social protocol of when you have a job, you show up on time. You also keep the restaurant open the hours that the restaurant is open. You don't close early. You treat people with respect, even if they're dicks. You know, there's so I had to teach them social protocol as I learned social protocol. Another thing that is not your fault is religious dogma. And oh my God, depending on where you're raised, I know I was raised Lutheran, and there was a lot of religious dogma. I remember every Sunday we would quote the Apostles' Creed, and you know, I was born sinful and unclean, and we would, you know, basically tell God what pieces of shit we are, and we would reinforce that every Sunday. And I remember one time going through the Apostles' Creed and the actual words, we would recite it kind of not thinking, you know, it's just something we did. It was part of the church service. When I actually read the words to it, I'm like, oh, this is fucked up shit, man. So realize what's your fault and realize what's not your fault. We have a lot of DNA, we have ancestral imprints, we have social protocol, we have religious dogma. The things people do to you are not your fault. And it's important to remember that. There's also acts of God. You can read about this in my book, and it's chapter 2, Shit That's Not Your Fault. And thank you for listening to my podcast. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at tobychristensen.com. And until next time, keep looking up.